Now that we got our first basic pages in place, before we add more route features, let's add some data, some dummy data which we can output for now. And I'll start in the all quotes page. In there, I want to output a list of quotes. And a little bit later in this section, we're going to fetch those quotes from a server. For the moment, let's work with some dummy quotes here, some dummy data, which I just define here in a constant. It should be an array of quotes, and every quote should be an object with an ID, any ID you want, like Q1. Then we also want to have an author field, and here I'll just use my name, and a text field with, well, the actual text of the quote. For example, learning React is fun. And then I'll copy that and create another quote with a different ID and a different author, because that's me with my full name. And the quote is learning React is great. Now that's just some dummy data here. Now the goal is to output that data, and that starting project, which I provided to you, does have a quote list component. This quote list component in the end just renders an unordered list here, and that unordered list renders a bunch of quote items, and a quote item looks like this. Now, therefore, in all quotes, I want to output that quote list. And hence, we should first of all import this quote list component from going up one level, diving into components, quotes, quote list. And then here, in all quotes, instead of returning this h1 tag, I'll return quote list. And now this quote list component in the end wants a quotes prop, because I'm accessing that quotes prop inside of quote list. And hence here I'll set quotes equal to my dummy quotes here. If I do that and save this, then on the all quotes page, we should see these two quotes. And we have these quote items with these buttons, which at the moment don't do anything. If we click them, nothing happens. But that is a first step. Now, if I do click such a item link here, if I do click view full screen, I of course want to load the quote detail page for that quote. And we'll implement that in the next step. Before we do that, let's go to add a quote and also work on this page. This page should display a form which allows us to add a new quote later. And for this, I did prepare this quote form component in the components folder. It is a component which renders a form and which also then has this submit form handler function, which doesn't do anything except for trigger a function which it expects to get on the on-add quote prop, to which it then passes this entered data. So in the component where we use quote form, we want to pass a function to the quote form component on that on-add quote prop, which expects this data. Hence, here in the new quote page, we want to use that quote form component. So we can import quote form from components, quotes, quote form, and then output this here instead, the quote form. And now here we need to pass this on-add quote prop, which I just talked about, which we expect inside of the quote form component. And as a value, we want to pass a function which expects this quote data. So here in the new quote page component, I'll add a new function, the add quote handler function, for example, where I expect to get some quote data, and where we then later will send this to a server. For the moment, I'll just console log the quote data here. And then it's this function, a pointer at this function, which we pass to quote form. With that, if we save this, we have this form here on this new quote page. So with that, this page and this demo project is slowly taking shape. Now let's make sure that clicking on view full screen, so on such a quote item on this link here, that clicking on this link actually loads this quote detail page. And definitely try implementing this on your own. Try implementing a link here which loads the detail page for the different quotes, so which respects the different quote IDs in the URL. We're going to implement this together and finish this quote detail page, at least a first draft, in the next lecture. So let's now connect these quote item links here. For this in the quote item component, I got this anchor tag. And this at the moment is basically just a placeholder so that we see this button link here. But it's not how we actually want to create that link. We could stick to an anchor tag with the ref attribute, but then you learned we have the problem that we actually will send a request and reload the page, and that's not something we want to do. Instead, we want to stay in the loaded single page application and let React Router do the URL changing and page updating. And therefore, in this quote item component, instead of using an anchor tag, we want to import the link component from React Router DOM. And then replace this anchor tag with this link component. Now this link component needs a toProp, and here we now need to set the path we want to go to. Now when it comes to that path, we have to keep in mind that for the quote detail page here, we actually have this dynamic segment in the URL. And we need that segment so that we can extract the data in that quote detail page and load the appropriate quote data for the selected quote. Now therefore, the path to which we want to link should be /quotes/ and then some concrete value for this placeholder. So here we actually want to create a dynamic value because we want to derive this path dynamically. And I'll do this with a template literal here. And it'll always start with /quotes, but then we have a segment thereafter, which is different for every quote item. So I'll inject this here into this template literal, and there we could expect that we get this ID prop, which identifies this specific quote item. And indeed, we will get an ID prop because in quote list, I'm setting an ID prop here. So we can extract props ID here to construct the path to this concrete quote, which we're outputting in this list. With that, if we save this, if we now click View Full Screen, we view the quote detail page for Q1, so for the first quote, and here for the second quote, it's Q2. So that works. And with that, we can now also continue working on that quote detail page a little bit. Because there, I don't just want to output this dummy content. Instead, I want to output the actual quote data. And later, we'll fetch this from a database. For the moment, I'll just use some dummy data. And I'll copy this dummy quotes array from all quotes and also add it here in quote detail. And of course, we could therefore also define it once in some global file and export it. But it's just some dummy data which we'll remove later anyways, so copying it here is fine. And now that it is copied, we can use this dummy quotes array to get the appropriate quote which we want to output here. We can get that quote, which we store maybe in a constant named quote, simply by reaching out to dummy quotes and then finding an item where the quote we're having a look at in this array has an ID which is equal to params.id, .quote ID. So equal to the ID we have in the URL. And .quote ID, well, because we have quote ID as a placeholder name here in the route definition. With this, we identify one of our quotes, and we can therefore then output this quote data. Now for that, I prepared another component, the highlighted quote component, which simply, well, outputs and styles a single quote, and therefore we can use this component here. I'll import the highlighted quote component from components, quotes, highlighted quote, and replace this h1 tag and this paragraph with highlighted quote. And now this highlighted quote component wants a text prop and an author prop. And hence I'll set these two props. I'll set text equal to quote.text and author equal to quote.author. author. Now, of course, we could be visiting this quote detail page with an ID which is not part of this quote array. So we also might want to handle this. We might want to check if quote is undefined. So if not quote, if we didn't find a quote for the ID we had in the URL, because of course a user can enter anything in that URL. I can click on these links and I only have quotes that actually exist, but I can manually enter Q3 here, and then I'll not have a quote. And therefore, we might want to handle that case. And if we don't have a quote, we want to return and display some fallback content, maybe a paragraph where we say no quote found. Anything like that. And with that, if I enter Q3 here, we get no quote found. Of course, we could change the styling of that text. But if I do enter a valid ID, I see that quote instead. And it's styled like this because of this highlighted quote component. So with that, we're also outputting some dummy data on this quote detail page. Now let's get back to routing itself and dive into more routing features which we also might need in applications which we're building. In the last lecture, we worked on this quote detail page and we made sure that if I enter an unknown quote ID here, I get some fallback text here. But what if I enter a totally unknown route to begin with? Something like my domain/hello. Then we have this blank page. And in reality, we typically instead want to show some 404 page, a fallback page that tells the user that this page doesn't exist, instead of just showing a blank page. And we can also add such a 404 page, a not found page with React Router as well. For this, I'll first of all add a new page here in the pages folder, and that's the not found JS file. And in there, I'll add the not found component and export this here. And then there, I'll just return a div with a class name of centered. And now that's not a CSS module class name, but a globally defined CSS class name defined here in this index CSS file. And in this div, I'll then just say page not found. And of course, you can change the content of this page and style it however you want. Now with that, we have this not found page component defined, but how do we now make sure that it is showing up if a user enters some unsupported path? For this, we can go back to our root route definition, because here we are defining all the routes our application supports. Now, if we go through that switch statement and we didn't have a single match, for example, for /hello, we don't have a match here, then we leave the switch statement without a match and hence nothing shows up on the screen. Therefore, to show a fallback, a not found page, the approach typically is that we add one route here at the end, which is looked at if no other route matched, where we match all incoming requests, so to say. So where we match all URLs. And we do that by setting the path to a star. This wildcard character signals to React Router that any path, any URL should match this route. And therefore, this route has to come last so that it does not consume one of the requests to one of the actual routes we have. But if we didn't have any match up to this point, then we want to match all URLs with this route and then just render this not found page here. So here I'll now import not found from pages not found and output this not found component here in this match all route here, which is only considered if no other route matched. And with this, if I save this for hello, we get this page not found text. On the other hand, if I do enter /quotes, so I do visit one of my supported pages, then I see that page. And with this, we also added this not found page, which of course is another common requirement you might have in your applications. Now this demo application is taking shape. Let's now take a look at this add a quote form. Now we will later add the actual logic for adding a quote. For the moment, if we open the DevTools, if I enter some data here, we just see it logged to the console because that's all we're doing upon a form submission. But let's imagine that this actually would be sent to a server. What would we typically expect from an application, from a website, if we submitted a form? We typically expect either some success message, maybe a modal overlay which opens up, or we expect that we navigate somewhere else. If I add a new quote and that request was sent to the server, I might expect that I'm automatically navigated away from this page, maybe to the all quotes page. And that is something which I do want to implement here as well. Now for that, of course, we could convert our submit button here in the quote form to a link so that it links to the all quote page. But actually here we don't want a link, we want a button which submits the form. So using a link is not an option here. Instead, what we need here is something called programmatic navigation. We want to trigger a navigation action and navigate the user away programmatically in our code. So it's not a link which the user clicks to navigate away, but it's some action triggered by our code when some other action, sending the entered data to a server, finished. And in the end, we probably want to trigger this navigation action from inside the new quote page component here. Because here we do have this add quote handler where we will later send the requests to the server, and therefore it's here where we also want to navigate away. But how can we now navigate programmatically? How can we tell React Router that we want to switch pages? Well, for this, React Router again has a hook which we can import. So we can import from React Router DOM, and we can import the use history hook. The name might be a bit strange, but it's named like this because it allows us to change the browser history. So the history of pages we visited. We call use history like this, and that gives us a history object, which we can store in a constant. And it's then this history object which we can use to trigger certain history changing actions. And what changes the history of pages? Well, for example, if we add a new page, if we go to a new page. And we can navigate around with the push method here, which pushes a new page on the stack of pages, so a new page on our history of pages. Or we can navigate with the replace method. That replaces the current page. The difference is that with push, we can go back with the back button to the page we're coming from. With replace, we can't. So replace is like a redirect where we change the current page. Push adds a new page. And it's up to you what you want. Do you want to allow your user to go back or not? Here I'll go for push and I will allow the user to go back. And then here we could go to /quotes like this. So now we will navigate away if we send our data here. At the moment, of course, we're only logging it to the console. But with that, if we now save this, if I enter some data here, this is a test, and I click add quote, you see it's logged to the console, but we're also navigated away. And that is how we can implement programmatic navigation with React Router. Now let's actually stay on this form page. If I'm the user of this page and I started entering something like test and I started entering some text here, but then I accidentally swiped back or pressed the back button, then I just go away and all my state is lost. Whatever I entered here is lost. Now you might have noticed that on some web pages where you can enter data in a form, this is prevented by a prompt, which is shown to you asking you if you really want to navigate away. So that as soon as you started working on that form, you can't accidentally leave it. And that's a behavior we also might want to implement. And React Router also makes that very simple. To implement it, we can go to this quote form component where we have this form, and we want to do two things. First, we want to determine when the user starts working with this form. For example, when this form gains focus. Then, as a second step, we want to show a warning to the user if he or she tries to leave the page after starting to work on that form. Now, to find out if the form is active, we can listen to the onFocus event here. Or we can set this onFocus prop and then trigger some function when this form gains focus. The form focused handler could be the function which we want to trigger. So that's the function I'll connect here. If I just console log focus here in this function, then you will notice in the DevTools that if I reload this page, we don't see focus. But if I click anywhere on this form, then I do get this. If I click into this input here, I do get focus logged to the console. So this is how this form then becomes active. Now in this form focused handler, we now want to store that information that this form was focused. And we then want to show a warning if the user tries to navigate away. Now for storing the information that the form was focused, we can use state. We can import the useState hook from React and add a new piece of state here in this component. Initially it's false maybe, because this is the isEntering state maybe. Set is entering, because the user started entering data, or at least the user started working on that form. Now I want to set isEntering to true if this form focused handler fires. So then I'll set this to true and change this state. With that, we now know once the user is working on the form. Showing a warning to the user when the user then tries to leave that form, maybe accidentally, is then rather straightforward actually. Because for this, React Router has a special component which we can use. So from React Router DOM, we can import something, and that something is the prompt component. This is a component which we can render, and then this component will automatically watch if we navigate away, and if then a certain condition is met, it will show a warning before it allows us to leave. Now for this, we need to render this component, and for that we can actually use a fragment to wrap this card, and then side by side to this card, render this prompt component as a self-closing component. Now prompt needs two props. It needs a when prop where we pass in true or false, defining whether this prompt should be shown if the user changes the URL or not. And I want to show it if isEntering is true, and that should be isEntering here, by the way. So isEntering, if isEntering is true, then I want to show this prompt if the user tries to leave the page. We can also set a message prop then, which actually takes a function which should return a string with the text we want to show to the user when he or she tries to leave. This is a function because we get some location object here which holds information about the page we're trying to go to. This would allow us to include the path we're trying to go to in this message which we're showing. But here I don't care about this location. I'll just say, are you sure you want to leave? All your entered data will be lost. And that's the message which I'll show to the user when he or she tries to leave this page. With that, if we now save this, if I reload this page and I go to a different page, this works because I haven't touched the form yet. If I do touch the form though, and I then, for example, click on all quotes, I do get this prompt though. Here we see the message we entered, and if I click cancel, we stay on this page. Of course, I can still leave by clicking OK, so I can overwrite this, but I get this extra warning if I started working on the form to ensure that I don't accidentally lose my entered data. At the moment, we just have a small flaw here though. Even if I do enter data and I click add quote, I'll get this warning. And that's of course not the desired behavior. And to ensure that we don't get this warning in this case, we could, for example, add an extra click listener here on this button which submits the form and trigger the finish entering handler function, which we have yet to add, and then define this extra function, the finish entering handler function here. And here I then call set is entering and set this to false, so that I do not block transitions anymore. And with that, if we save this, now we can leave that page. So if I do not click add quote and the form has focus, I get the warning. If I do enter something here though, and I then click this button, then I can navigate away. Setting set is entering to false inside of the submit form handler would not work because that's a little bit too late. This state update would not go through before we actually trigger the navigation action, because the navigation action will be triggered in on add quote, so that's all one synchronous process, it's one function in the end, and hence the state update would not be processed before we try to navigate away. That's why I'm using a separate function for that here, which triggers when the button is clicked and therefore before we actually handle the form submission. And with that, we're also using this prompt component React Router gives us to ensure that we prevent unwanted transitions.